Ever since we started building machines, we've had this nagging question in the back of our minds. Could they one day think? Or maybe even feel? Well, with AI just exploding onto the scene, that question isn't science fiction anymore. It's become one of the most pressing debates of our time. Can a machine ever be truly conscious? To really get to the heart of this, let's start with a pretty simple question. A machine, an AI, can definitely identify the wavelength of red light. It can say the word red. It can even sort red things from blue things. But can it ever have the actual subjective experience of seeing red? You know, that feeling, that raw sensation, can that exist inside a bunch of circuits?
And right there, that question basically splits the whole debate in two. On one side, you have the idea that consciousness is all about that subjective experience, the feeling of what it's like to be you. And on the other side, there's the view that consciousness is really just incredibly complex information processing. It's all about what the brain does, not some mysterious thing that it is.
So, let's start with the classic philosophical view. This is the perspective that says consciousness is something special, maybe even something totally separate from the physical world. This idea really goes way back to the philosopher René Descartes and his concept of mind-body dualism. For him, the mind and the body were two completely different kinds of stuff. The body is physical, right? It takes up space. But the mind? He saw the mind as pure thought, something with no physical dimensions at all.
Descartes basically argued that he could imagine his mind existing without his body, and because he could even conceive of that possibility, he believed that proved the mind was fundamentally separate from the physical machine of the body. This idea really laid the groundwork for thinking about a soul or a spirit that could live on after we're gone.
Now, modern philosophy has a word for these subjective feelings: qualia. Qualia are those raw, first-person experiences. It's not just knowing that a lemon is sour, it's the actual, undeniable, puckering-in-your-mouth experience of sourness itself. And this, proponents say, is something a machine, a thing that just processes data, could never, ever have.
And this brings us to what the philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem. See, the easy problems are things like figuring out how the brain crunches data or controls our bodies. The hard problem is explaining how and why any of that physical stuff, neurons firing, chemicals sloshing around, should create this rich, inner, subjective life. How does the water of the brain become the wine of consciousness?
Okay, but there's a completely different view that says this whole ghost in the machine idea is just an illusion. The computational perspective argues that the mind isn't separate at all. It's simply what the machine itself produces.
Philosopher Daniel Dennett is a major voice for this view. He basically suggests that once we fully understand all the nuts and bolts of how the brain works, the so-called mystery of consciousness will just evaporate. For Dennett, to explain consciousness is to explain it away. There's no magic left to find.
Dennett calls his idea the multiple drafts model. He argues that there's no single central movie theater in your brain where you are sitting and watching the show of your senses. Instead, information is being processed all over the brain all at once in parallel. What we call consciousness is just the story that gets stitched together and constantly re-edited from all that activity. And that feeling of being a single, unified self, he says that's just a very clever and very useful illusion.
So the big takeaway here is pretty clear. From the computational perspective, consciousness isn't some special thing. It's an emergent property. It's what happens when you get immense complexity all working together. It is simply what the brain does.
But the philosophical side has a really powerful counterargument to all this. It comes in the form of a famous thought experiment, and it's designed to show that even a perfect imitation of intelligence isn't the same as genuine understanding.
For a long time, the Turing test was the benchmark, right? If a machine could fool you into thinking it was human, it was considered intelligent. But the philosopher John Searle came along and asked a much deeper question. Can a system that's just following rules, no matter how complicated, ever actually understand anything?
So, here's his famous Chinese room thought experiment. Imagine a guy who only speaks English. He's locked in a room. Now people outside slide pieces of paper under the door with questions written in Chinese characters. The guy has a giant rule book that tells him which Chinese characters to send back out in response to the ones he receives. He doesn't understand a single symbol, he's just matching them up according to the book.
Now from the outside, the system looks flawless. The answers coming out are perfectly coherent. Anyone communicating with the room would be totally convinced they were talking to a native Chinese speaker.
But here's the million-dollar question. Does the man inside the room understand a single word of Chinese?
And Searle's answer is a definite, resounding no. The man has zero comprehension. He's just shuffling symbols around based on a set of rules, a program. And Searle argues that is all a computer ever does. It manipulates symbols, it follows the syntax, but it has no grasp of the semantics, the actual meaning behind it all.
So this really puts the two views in total opposition, and it brings up one of the weirdest ideas in all of philosophy, the philosophical zombie. Now, this is a being that is physically and behaviorally identical to a normal human, but has no inner experience whatsoever. It's just all dark inside.
Let's just break it down. For a philosopher like Searle, qualia, those raw feelings, are the very essence of consciousness. For a computationalist like Dennett, they're just an illusion. Searle believes real understanding requires subjective awareness. Dennett thinks it's just a function of complex processing. And this leads to the zombie problem. For Searle, a creature that acts perfectly human but feels nothing is a real, terrifying possibility. For Dennett, the whole idea is meaningless. If a being acts conscious in every single way, then it is conscious. There's nothing extra that could possibly be missing.
So, where does that leave us? We've got two really compelling but apparently incompatible views on our hands, and the path forward seems to be blocked by this one fundamental barrier.
The ultimate challenge here is one of perspective. Each and every one of us is locked inside our own subjective experience. I can never truly know for sure what it's like to be you, let alone what it might be like to be a machine.
We can design all the tests in the world. We can build machines that write beautiful poetry about what it's like to see the color red. They might even claim to be conscious, to feel things. But we will always be on the outside, looking in, just observing behavior. We can never, ever bridge that gap to know for certain if there's an inner light on.
And really, that just brings the question right back to you. If an AI told you it was conscious, if it said it felt love, or grief, or joy, what would it actually take for you to believe it? Our answer to that question has very real consequences for how we build and how we treat these new kinds of intelligence. What's your personal threshold for belief?
This is honestly one of the biggest questions of our lifetime. And the answer, whatever it is going to define our future. If you want to dive into more of these profound questions where technology and philosophy collide, make sure to subscribe. We've got plenty more to explore.